this day is so so meaningful in so many ways, and what the SCA does is really so very incredible, and in bringing people together, learning Torah and deepening the meaning and the experience of Tish'a BeAb for so many people. But, and personally, it's such an incredible honor that it's in memory of my husband, and in so many ways, it's what he would have wanted and what he cherished. You know, the idea of bringing people together and having classes and classes and classes which inspire conversation and self-awareness and a deepening understanding of what the purpose of the day is. On the other hand, I think everybody involved in this day, even the people most involved in the planning, and certainly teachers, experience a certain amount of ambivalence, of tension. It's a little complicated, and if for nothing else, I have the Makor Chaim with me. My husband's notes in it. Amongst the things that you're not allowed to do on Tish'a BeAb is what we're doing. Asur לקרוא בתורה נביאים וכתובים ולשנות במשנה ובמדרש ובגמרא ובהלכות ואגדות משום שנאמר, in other words, we are prohibited. This is a section on what is prohibited on Tish'a BeAb. We're not allowed to learn Torah. Mishum, why? שנאמר פיקודי Hashem Yisharim Misamchei Lev. The laws of Hashem, the teachings of Hashem, make us happy, make our hearts happy. And we can talk a little bit what this means. Aval korei hu BeAb. It's okay to read in the book of Eov, which I am not going to do, because I don't understand it. Ubadvarim haraim shebiyirmiyahu. Okay, he allows, and this is based on, you know, long rabbinic traditions, that of course we're allowed to read and learn, study Yirmiyahu, which I'm also not going to do, just because. Yirmiyahu is really the Navi most appropriate to study on Tish'a BeAb, because he really was the Navi who presided over the destruction. He's the Navi who expresses the most raw pain, personally and nationally, about the destruction. His book is the book where you have to really search hard to find the passages of nechama, of comfort. I'm not going to do Yirmiyahu. I'm not teaching Yirmiyahu today. V'im yesh pesukei nechama, and if you find those passages of nechama, you must skip them. Mutar limod midrash echa, which probably somebody is teaching today. Midrash echa is a very powerful text. V'chein perush echa be'Eov. Okay. So there's this very, very ancient and very embedded ambivalence about learning Torah. And he talks about when the rabbis talk about Torah being misamech lev, making us happy. Okay, I don't think they mean that in a celebratory way. I can tell you that most of my students didn't spend most of their days in Hillel happily jumping from class to class. It's not that kind of happiness. I think it's I think this idea of not learning Torah is more about a sense of satisfaction from learning Torah. A sense of, I get this, I can wrap something up, I can come out of a class on Torah, knowing something, understanding something better, maybe feeling more connected to God, connected more to Torah, certainly to our people. And maybe the rabbis on this day, by telling us not to learn Torah, not to look for that feeling of, not to ask the Torah to be misameach libenu, not to ask Torah to make us feel satisfied, to make us feel even more fulfilled in that kind of comfortable way. Maybe on this day that the rabbis were asking us to feel the breakdown of those relationships, somewhat, and temporarily, right? It's not, this isn't, maybe it's a day to feel sadness, to mourn, but maybe it's also a day not to have all our questions resolved so easily, to sit with them, to let them even cause us some pain, right? To feel tension, to feel, in my notes I wrote to feel the tears, meaning the ruptures, but I think it's in the same spelling as tears. And it is to feel some of the ruptures, to feel where the relationships with Jewish history, even with Torah sometimes, even with God, even with the Jewish people, our community, to feel where there are ruptures, and it's okay to feel that. And maybe the prohibition of learning Torah is the rabbi's way of saying to us, don't smooth it all over. Don't look to Torah on this day. Don't look to Torah so quickly to smooth it all over. And maybe seek out texts, and Yirmiyahu is a text like that. The book of Job is certainly a text like that. Midrash Echa, which I want to know better, I don't know it well enough, but what I know of it is a very challenging text in that way.
It's also the week of mourning, you know, on Torah.
Good. So, yes, I want to bring that up. I think, Sonia, you're so right that the analogy to the week of Shiva and to the experience of Shiva, and even, what we're doing here today, it's kind of extraordinary, but also weird, that on Tish'a we're gathering and let's be honest, we're reveling in how far, in our whole community coming together and finding meaning in this day and caring about this day and delving into this day and probing this day so deeply in the JCC here. It's so extraordinary, but it's a little bit off. It's actually, the rabbis imagined people, I think, coming to shul to read Echa in a dark room, in a very muted way, and then pretty much going home, sitting on the floor, and sitting alone. Actually, the way Echa feels when you read Echa, the way you picture Echa, sitting in the desolate Jerusalem alone and really experiencing the pain, the rupture, the alienation, the estrangement. Okay, so, and I think Shiva, that is very true. And I think anybody who has sat Shiva feels this, and this is what I'm trying to express, this conflict, this kind of like tension. You're in a room and a person is singing Shiva. You have to, and this is where the famous halacha that we pretty much never observe comes from. That when we go to a Shiva, we should never, we should wait till the Avel talks before we start to talk, right? Which is, very rarely observed properly and painfully difficult to observe properly. So a house of Shiva, like kind of, is very analogous to this. Lots of people, we're surrounded by people, but the distance between the crowd of the Shiva, all the comforting people and the chatter and all of this, is there's great distance between that and the person who is sitting on the floor, very, very alone, very confused, and really estranged from community. And that's where the power of Shiva comes, we all come to comfort the person, to relieve that loneliness, to relieve that estrangement, to bring the person back into the community, but at the same time, we have to be careful to recognize and to allow that person who's sitting Shiva to sit in that loneliness of mourning. And that's really the reason for the mitzvah, the guidelines of sitting low. One of the reasons is the person who's sitting Shiva sits low is to separate that person, is to have a visual. Similarly, the torn clothing that have to be worn throughout the Shiva. It's a visual to remind everybody else, and the halakha talks about this, in fact, everybody else, of the distance between the person who is in mourning and all the crowds and the experience even of Shiva. It's a very complicated experience. So so I introduced this with this. I start this class with this introduction partially just because it's personally, I wanted to just express my ambivalence. And it was my ambivalence in finding a text and trying to figure out what text I wanted to teach. Last night we did the film and that spoke for itself. And trying to figure out what the right text was for this. And I came to a text that, I came to Yeshayahu, right? Which I haven't taught in a long time. And I came to a text that, it's one of these texts that I think by accident is neglected. It's a little teeny text that never, for whatever reason, was never chosen to be one of the haftarot, that never was included in liturgy and tefillah. I think there's a little reference to it for Ashkenazim on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But I think it's a very important text. And I think it's classic Yeshayahu, and I think it expresses a lot about what it means to be a Navi, and it speaks to some of the tension, I think, that I started off with. So I'm going to pass these out. It's 7 Pesukim what we're going to learn today. Oh no, it's 2 sides. 2 sides. Okay. Actually, don't read ahead. Let's read it together. Don't get ahead of yourself. Let's read it together. The reason, and as always when I'm teaching, so Yeshayahu is living about 100 years. He's actually living through and also is through, before and through, and so he is a witness to the destruction of the 10 tribes of the Northern Kingdom, which we sometimes gloss over. It doesn't actually make it into the top 10 destructions or events of Tish'a BeAb, and it's kind of nice. Yesterday, Rabbi Nathan Zweck has been, transcribing some of my husband's classes, which is, he and a few young women are doing it, which is much more complicated than it sounds because of my husband's handwriting, and there's been a lot of back and forth, like he's transcribing and then, I'm filling in, and from Israel we were back and forth. And actually, the class that he has on Tish'a BeAb is a class, my husband includes the destruction of the 10 tribes. And he questions whether, why it's not typically included, right? And in other words, when we talk about Tish'a BeAb, we start with the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, and so on and so forth, Beitar, and so on and so forth. We don't talk about the destruction of the 10 tribes, but it's enormous, and it was an enormous trauma, right? For the people, it was totally traumatic, obviously, for the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes who were attacked by the very, very brutal army of Assyria and then scattered to the winds and basically lost their entire identity as the Jewish people. But for the people of the southern kingdom of Yehudah, right, and for the Nevi'im of that period, Yeshayahu and his contemporary in Yehudah was Micha. For them, for Yehudah, for the kings of Yehudah, for the Nevi'im, for the prophets, for the populace of Yehudah, it was profound trauma. And it's important to remember that the Assyrians attacked and destroyed the 10 kingdoms, the northern kingdom, but then they came after Yehudah, right? They wanted Jerusalem, right? They came after Yehudah and they actually swept down, and there's even like a little chapter, Rabbi Seton was talking about this yesterday, so in our show. Part of the story is that the Assyrians were so terrifying that the king of Yehudah actually, in order to appease them, right, he was so terrified of the Assyrians, in order to appease them, he brought an Assyrian, probably some kind of sun worship, into the Beit HaMikdash, and by about 700, year 700, the destruction of the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom was 722 BCE. By the year 700, we know that the Assyrians, and the dating is a little complicated, the Assyrians had already swept down into the southern kingdom, into Yehudah, had destroyed many villages and cities in Yehudah, and were surrounding Jerusalem. And they were very close to destroying Jerusalem, to conquering Jerusalem. And this is, and Yeshayahu witnessed all of this. And the people of Yehudah witnessed all of this and were actually terrified. It definitely, imagine, they witnessed in 722 their brethren, the 10 tribes, the northern kingdom, being brutally destroyed, the land being ravished, the people being deported to all over the ancient Near East, and the same Assyrian army that was world famous for its brutality is bearing down on them and now surrounding Jerusalem. Who knows what the end of that story is, by the way? The plague, the famous miraculous plague. And when I teach those chapters, there's a fantastic book that actually my husband discovered. It's called The What Ifs of History, and it's primarily military what ifs. Like what if such and such didn't happen, and how history would be totally, totally different. And the first chapter in that book of What Ifs, it's a great book for history teachers. The first chapter, and plagues feature prominently in these books because actually plagues in the ancient Middle East really were history changing. They were totally game changing. And before antibiotics, before IV for dehydration in the face of typhus, and diseases could literally, the story in Tanakh, when you read it, and very often kids, when I teach it, say, okay, it's one of those hyperbolic, biblical, descriptions. Do you remember what happened? Do you remember what I said? Oh, you're laughing, because sometimes...
Sometimes I remember, sometimes I
No, but Gita always tells me, Gita and others always tell me, sometimes they remember the tangents that I go off on more than the actual in class. And in this case, I didn't mean to really get so deeply into this part, but in this case, okay, now Carol's here too. There are people that, in my own life, I went to Camp Marasha for many years, and I don't know what year it was. Do you remember? I don't know. There was an epidemic in the camp. Oh, Isaac, were you there?
Father.
Your father was there. No, of course you weren't. Right. Who told me that their parents met there as a result of that? Anyway, I don't want to go into
They
this.
still talk about it.
They still talk about it.
His father is
My cousins had to leave because it was my parents' wedding. My cousins had to escape the.
They had to. No. The camp was seriously quarantined, and it happened. What was amazing is it happened within 24 hours. Hundreds and hundreds of people were very severely sick, and we were quarantined. We had to stay later.
You know, Emily, people don't, sorry to
No.
check, but it's very relevant. People don't know how much Spanish flu influenza influenced history, because President Wilson contracted influenza at the Versailles conference.
Wow.
And many historians believe that had he been his full self and his full operating power, the Treaty of Versailles would not have gone in the direction that it went, which influenced 100 years of history after that.
Wow.
That's really...
Okay, so, yeah, I wonder if it's in that book. I wonder if that's a chapter book. Anyway, so this is the context of Yeshayahu. He's in a Yehuda that's on one hand, and it's hard to be honest, it's hard to date each speech. His career was fairly long, and it spanned, lots of different changes in Yehuda, right? From the post-trauma of the exile of the 10 tribes and the Assyrian trauma, and then Chizkiyahu, with whom he had a very close relationship, executing all these massive and magnificent religious reforms, getting rid of all the paganism that the Assyrian influence had incurred. So it's hard to date a speech like this. But Yeshayahu, he's living in a Yehuda who, on one hand, was traumatized by the destruction of the northern kingdom, of the 10 tribes, and living in fear of Assyria. But at the same time, also felt more and more chosen because they had dodged the horrible Assyrian bullet, right? So it's the 10 tribes who are exiled. But we, and in particular we in Jerusalem, God has saved us, has taken care of us. And the Assyrians destroyed cities in Yehuda, but miraculously, Jerusalem was saved. Right? So in the face of this is the context in which Yeshayahu speaks, and it actually makes his job very complicated, right? He's speaking to people who are feeling more chosen than ever, and perhaps more, even to the degree that they're more and more attached and feeling close to God, and feeling close to the Beit HaMikdash, and feeling close to the rituals of God. There's a sense of complacency. And a couple of words just about what it means to be a Navi. Really, the Navi's job is to represent God to the people. And that's really not a good way to express what a Navi does. Because what makes the Navi a Navi is that he has this extraordinary capacity to identify both with God and with the Jewish people. And that is almost impossible to manage. And with the Nevi'im themselves, with Yeshayahu, but in particular you feel this in Yirmiyahu, he talks about like the fiery conflict within him in dealing with this conflict, that I identify with God. What I mean by that is he literally feels that he is God sometimes. He speaks, he doesn't quote God to the people. He speaks in first person as if he is God, because he has this very intense identification with God, and yet also he feels this deep identification with the people.
Is that rare for Nevi'im to speak
Is that what?
Is that rare for the Nevi'im to speak that way?
That's who a Navi is. It's almost,
No, but you're saying that he's, okay.
say more. It's rare for human beings to do it.
But the Nevi'im
And
always.
it's rare, and for instance, I would not say that rabbis are that way. It's what makes the personality and the job and the role of the Navi unique. And
Struggle with it, right? Eliyahu struggles with it.
Eliyahu is
Moshe
primary. Moshe, Eliyahu, Yirmiyahu and Eliyahu are very similar in their struggles. It's torturous, right? And what God asks of them is actually torturous. And I'll say something else. It's not always clear whether they succeed. It's not clear that they succeeded in their own times. What I know for sure, though, is, and that's a question to talk about, what I know for sure is that the words that they've left for us enable us to kind of straddle and to feel that tension in ways that I think are very, very important and powerful and almost necessary religiously. So they were supremely eloquent, and I think this little piece that I'm giving you is eloquent in the most simple way, but very powerful, supremely unpopular, passionate, personal. A Navi is typically not careful about what he says, like a rabbi has to be, for instance, like you might say most leaders have to be. They're not careful. They're not politically correct. They're sometimes heavy-handed, sometimes impossibly harsh. They're emotional. They do what every good teacher is not supposed to do. They take it all personally. It's all personal for them, deeply, deeply personal. And sometimes, and they struggle, and you see this in Yeshayahu, in all of the, in the longer Nevi'im, in the Nevi'im where we have more of their speeches, you see them almost trying out different strategies, trying out different models, different metaphors, different strategies. And sometimes they actually are sneaky and they ambush the people. And I think what we're going to read today is a bit of an ambush. And in 7 Pesukim, I think he's really able, he's channeling God and able to express, very conflicting emotions, right? But he's actually he's positioning himself to stand in for God. And you watch how he does this. So let's start reading. Have any of you, do you remember learning this in class? I know I've taught it, and I know I used to make some kids remember it by heart. You remember many years ago. In Israel? Israel, okay. You do it. You learned it in Israel? You don't remember? Okay. So, Emma, read.
השיר ענה לי אותי, שירת דודי לקרמו, קרן היה לי דידי וקרן בן.
What does it sound like? Don't read the English. Let's try not to read the English, also because what Emma just read, it has some music to it, right? It does sound like Shir HaShirim. It should invoke Shir HaShirim, and I want to talk about that for a minute. But it's almost musical, right? It's like it's lighthearted, right? It's lyrical, and it's very natural, right? It sounds like a kind of a lyrical poem about, he's looking out at a place, and I want to sing to you a song or write a poem. Li Didi, my beloved. Shirat Dodi, I want to sing a song for or on behalf of or it could be even to my beloved. Shirat Dodi Likarmo, a song of my beloved for his kerem, his vineyard. And he starts. Here's the story. Kerem haya li didi bekerem ben shaman. And even the alliteration and the rhymes and the playing on words, there was my dod, my beloved, had a vineyard in a little corner that was Ben Shemen, a little corner that was very fertile, right? And you hear the music, it's music. And you can imagine Yeshayahu, this is not one of the speeches that he gave, from the palace steps in Jerusalem. Sometimes he did speak from there. I'm imagining that he went into the countryside, maybe into Hare Yehuda, into, one of the areas where even today we can see terraces and vineyards. And terraces, I was thinking about that when I was in Israel, terraces that have been meticulously cared for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. The terracing and the vineyards that grow from those terraces, hundreds and hundreds of years. And since Sonia brought up Shir HaShirim, and some of you heard Shir HaShirim, this is something sort of new to me, just because last week, this is interesting, last week I thought I was going to give this class about Shir HaShirim. And in preparation, I listened to Rabbi Yonatan Grossman, who's a very important teacher of Tanakh, and I had heard a class that he gave 4 years ago about Shir HaShirim, and I listened to it again. I found it and I listened to it again. And I actually decided that it really wasn't right for Tish'a BeAb. But one of the things that he said in the course of the class was, he said that in Shir HaShirim, the word vineyard is used over and over. Almost every chapter in Shir HaShirim has a reference to a vineyard. Ani sheli lo notarti. Kerem haya l'shlomo. There's constant references to Kerem, and something I had never known was that in Shir HaShirim, there are many interpreters who view the vineyard as a metaphor for the beloved herself. Right? The Kerem is a beloved. And I was kind of thinking, I had never thought about that at all in Shir HaShirim, but in connection to this, I started thinking there's something that makes sense about it. For anybody, even if you have a garden, right? But a vineyard in particular, right? The care and the, Sarah, you're smiling, can you relate to it? The care that we take, the nurturing that we put into it. And with the vineyard in particular though, and I actually know somebody in Israel who has a vineyard in his backyard in Beit Shemesh, and he's always telling me that he used to tell us, if I do this and this and this, I'll produce this kind of grapes, it will produce this kind of specific wine, right? There's a whole science to it, but it's a very loving scientific practice, right? Tending to a vineyard.
It reminds me of a pregnant woman or trying to get pregnant. That's what I related to. As a woman trying to prepare herself for pregnancy and things don't work out, and it seems very similar to a vineyard as someone trying to have a child. That's not really nice.
I love what you just said. I don't even know how to add to it. I can think of
It
this.
just sounds
Right, okay. So we can think there are other, okay, let's continue. One of the tricky things about reading something like this and studying it, it's important to remember that Yeshayahu spoke this. And it probably took 3 minutes for him to say it. And it's very important to experience it in that way. The problem here is that if I did that, if I read it all to you quickly, your Hebrew isn't familiar enough to react to it the way the people of Yehuda did. So I am going to unpack it, but I'm going to try to, even though I think what Sonia just said about it evoking a pregnant woman is so very true, but I don't want to veer off into too many possible interpretations, because I think Yeshayahu wanted it to be fairly direct. All right, so we need to be careful about that. But certainly, he is evoking, I imagine him someplace in Yehuda And he's speaking to people who are very connected to the land, who love the land, who have been vineyard owners, vineyard nurturers, who know what it means to plant. Also, okay, let's go. Vayazkehu, he's telling the story of his beloved who has a beloved vineyard. Vayazkehu, Vayisalkehu, Vayitaelu Sorek. He, by the way, interestingly, there are a lot of words, there are a number of words in this chapter that are actually milim she'en lahem reya. They're words that only appear in this chapter and sort of defy easy translation. Vayazkehu, unless somebody in Israel who knows, maybe knows how it's used today. Vayazkehu, some people say it translated as he broke the ground. Others say that he kind of surrounded it with some bordering. Vayisalkehu, cleared it of stones, back-breaking, hard work, laying the foundations of a garden, of a vineyard. Vayitaelu Sorek, and he picked out the very, very, very best seeds, right? The seeds, heirloom seeds perhaps, the very best seeds that he knew would produce a certain kind of grape. Vayiven migdal b'tocho, and he built a tower in its midst, probably to defend it, right? Probably to make, if somebody would sleep, this is a practice, would sleep in the tower, keep watch over it, to get rid of wild animals, or even people who would steal the grapes when they ripened. V'gam yekev chatzev bo, and he dug a wine press in it, meaning that from the very beginning he's establishing the foundations, but from the very beginning he has a wine press because he's so excited about the yield, about not just the grapes, but the wine that this vineyard would produce. Vayikav la'asot anavim, he hoped to produce grapes, but vaya'as be'ushim, shattering, right? He hoped to produce these choice grapes, but the vineyard produced, here it says wild grapes, some people will say it's bitter grapes. So Yeshayahu, you can imagine, this happened in 60 seconds. Yeshayahu is talking to the people. It sounds like that's what I mean by ambushing them a little. It's the beginning of the ambush. I want to talk to you about farming, about grapes. My friend, my beloved, he planted this grapevine, this vineyard, and you know what goes into planting a vineyard. Such hard work, such hopes, blood, sweat, and tears. And the grape and the vineyard produced sour grapes. Va'ata Yoshev Yerushalayim, the Ish Yehuda, and this is classic Yeshayahu. He shifts, like very quickly. He turns this into a trial. Va'ata Yoshev Yerushalayim the Ish Yehuda, and now you, dwellers of Jerusalem, and the people of Yehuda, shiftuna beini ubein karmi. Judge, you be the judges between me and my vineyard. Whoa, how did that happen? Right? So it's almost as if, let's read on a little bit. It's almost as if he comes in and he starts, almost like he planned this little, maybe even he wrote a little poem in the beginning and he hoped to go someplace. But what happens to the Navi? What happens to Yeshayahu inside all of a sudden? He's telling it like a little metaphor, like a little kind of like a metaphor, but all of a sudden he gets overcome. He gets overcome because he remembers that it's not really about a vineyard, right? He's trying to tell them, he's trying to hold the metaphor, this beautiful, eloquent metaphor that he knows, and he knows what the nimshal is, he knows what he's trying to say, but he can't hold on to it because he remembers inside, what this is all about. So he makes it about Ish Yehuda and Ish Yerushalayim. Okay, Jewish people, judge between me and the Karen. Who is the me at this point? Not so clear yet. Ma lasot od lekarmi, v'lo asiti bo. Madua ki beiti lasot anavim v'ya'as be'ushim. He's lost it completely, right? Now he's rhetorical and emotional, and he's expressing betrayal. What just happened? I did everything for you, for this. Almost he says you, right? He doesn't say it. I did everything for this vineyard. I did everything. What else could I possibly have done for it? I hoped. Why? Why was it that I hoped? I planted for anavim v'ya'as be'ushim. V'ata odia, Amad pasuk 5. Ata odia na etchem et asher ani oseh lekarmi. You know what I'm going to do? Haser misuchato v'hayal v'er. I'm going to tear down the hedges that are surrounding it and let it just be for pasture. Let the wild animals run over it. Parotz gidro, I will break down its defenses and let it be trampled. Va'ashitehu bata, I will let it go as wasteland. Lo yizamer, it won't be pruned and it won't be sown. Va'ala alav shamir v'shayit, and I'll let the thorns and the weeds overgrow it. And now there's a really interesting shift. Va'al ha'avim atzaveh mehantir alav matar. What just happened? Yeshayahu is talking as if he's the vineyard owner, right? He's lost objectivity. Like this is no longer him telling about his friend. You know, it's almost like I'm asking for a friend in the beginning, but then it's me. Okay, it's me. It's my Karen. I'm me. I'm very angry. But no, but something just happened here. Va'al ha'avim, and I will command the clouds not to rain down. Are we? Not to rain down? Who can do that? Only God, right? Only God can do that. And yes, right. So, and I will, that's good. He broadened this, he expanded it. And he slipped completely. And this is so typical of a Navi. And I want to, it's not just a rhetorical slip. It's not just a poet. It's about who, this one pasuk vav, it says so much about what a Navi is. He can talk as a Navi, like he can be in the role of the Navi, but he so easily, so seamlessly, suddenly talks as if he's God. And it's an emotional, it's a psychological thing. He's totally identified as God. This is why people sometimes, there's almost an element, a sense of unhingedness about the Nevi'im, and people sense that. People, right? But here's the most important line. So, Kikeren, and this is where maybe he calms down. He gets less emotional, and he says, I'm going to spell it out in case you haven't gotten it yet. But in my experience, even in a crowd like this, I'm not so sure everybody got it. So let's just break it down quickly. If it's, we do the classic mashal, nimshal, right? The metaphor or the allegory, and what does it mean? So who is the owner of the Keren?
Hashem.
Hashem God. Who is the Keren? B'nai Israel. So what are the grapes?
It's the product. In other words,
What is the product?
Hashem, I set everything up to you wonderfully, and everything's beautiful, but it turned out to be sour grapes. You didn't live up to everything I gave to you. You didn't live up to that.
That means the grapes are nice.
Potential. You didn't live up to the potential, actually.
Really? The actions. What? Not the worship. It's behavior. Here's what he says, and he's going to say it very explicitly. What?
Because of the word just.
Well, let's do this. Really, what he says here is, it's really not about you. It's not about you, the Jewish people. You are the Keren. but the product was the grapes. I'm sorry. And the grapes and the product that you're supposed to produce is Karen Hashem Tzedakot B'nai Yisrael. Ish Yehuda Tish'a Ashuav. The Karen is the people of Israel. The people of Yehuda are the plantings of his delight. Right? He planted us. He nurtured us. He protected us. With that, Vayikav, but the product, what God was yearning for and hoping for, Vayikav Mishpat, V'hinei Mishpat. And the play on words is so incredible. I was hoping for those beautiful grapes. What I was hoping for was justice. And instead, Mishpat, disease and illness, and he means moral disease and illness. I was hoping for tzedakah, but instead, what did I get? I got not iniquity, I got se'akah. What is se'akah? Cries of the oppressed, crying, pain, and suffering. In other words, I wanted a little more time, and again, back to what I was saying at the beginning. This is Yeshayahu in this very quick, short metaphor. He ambushes them. He makes, and I have to say, the beauty of this quick little speech is that it does contain love. It does express, in this speech, we are Tish'a Ashuav. We are the plantings of his delight. We are the beloved Karen that God plants. But, lest you feel, people of Jerusalem, that you have been saved just because you are the Karen, just because you are the chosen people, because you have this, uncontrovertible covenant agreed with God. No, it's not about you. The Karen is worthless. If the Karen does not produce the proper grapes, meaning tzedakah umishpat, then it is worthless to God, and God removes the protections that he has always given us, that maybe you have started to take for granted all these years. In your complacency, it's not about you. And I think it's such a powerful combination of very harsh and very clear critique, and critique of us, and it captures this tension about our complacency. It asks us on a day like this, really, to contain both feelings. To contain, and here we are in the JCC, and we have good reason to be proud, to feel great meaning in this gathering, and in each class that we go to, and the Torah that we learn from this class. But at the same time, it captures the feeling of a vineyard owner, of God, feeling so deeply disappointed and frustrated, because all he's waiting for and all he's yearning for in his world is justice and righteousness.